going to get started, and I'm sure more people will join here in the next few minutes. So welcome everybody to this MIT Club of Great Britain event, speaker event, a fireside chat about Ukraine with our speaker, Marco Carnevale. We are excited to have this fireside chat here, which we're doing exclusively virtually to maximize attendance. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you attending wherever you may be, as we have alumni joining from all over the world, most notably from Great Britain as the club hosts this event. My name is Wissam Al-Monthiri. I'm the president of the MIT Club of Great Britain. And as I said, we are hosting this event, but have people joining from all over. Our topic is a fireside chat about the current situation in Ukraine, which is obviously very topical and on top of people's minds. We will have a speaking session. So Marco, who I'll hand over to in a few minutes, will speak probably for about 20 to 25 minutes. And after that, we're going to turn it over to a discussion. And our request is, please participate as actively as you can in the discussion. It's a very topical matter, so I'm sure many of you may be experts on the matter. Some of you just interested so please participate. And you can do so either by typing in the chat box on Zoom, which hopefully you know how to use, or you can raise your hand virtually on the Zoom function, and either myself or Marco will call you out to be able to jump in and ask your question or open up your discussion topic. So that'll be, as I said, in about 25 minutes after Marco gets done speaking. Before I hand over to Marco, it's my pleasure to introduce him, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Marco. He may be the most interesting man in the world, as you'll hear from his biography. So Marco Carnevale has a Bachelor's of Science degree in International Relations from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He has a PhD in Strategic Studies from MIT, which he received in 1989. Later, Marco worked as a project director at the Italian Institute for International Affairs, and he also wrote for the Treccani Italian Encyclopedia. Marco is the author of many articles and books on international relations, and notably worked as a civil servant at NATO at the headquarters from 1994 to 2001, where he was in charge of NATO's relations with Ukraine. Marco later worked as an adventure tour leader in Africa, East Asia, and the Pacific. He's a certified sommelier and now lives in London, busy writing and speaking about wine, travel, and international affairs. His books on international relations and adventure travel can be found on Amazon for those of you who are interested. So I think I've built him up quite big, but I'm sure he's only going to exceed that. So let me please hand over to our speaker for today, Marco. Over to you, Marco.
Thank you, Wissam, for your kind words, and thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Diane, for organizing this for the Alumni Association. It's a pleasure for me to be back with MIT colleagues. The reason why I thought I would have this, proposed to have this chat today is because I studied strategic and military affairs, strategic studies and military affairs at MIT. And then it so happened that I worked a lot on Ukraine when I was at NATO. So what I'm going to try to do is to put together these two sort of hats of mine and offer you some points within the time limit that we have for reflection, trying to understand what has been going on and where we come from and what possibly we might get into going into the future when this mess is over. I will so touch on a few points that will not be exhaustive, but I hope that there will be Q's and A's afterwards that will allow me to go a little bit deeper into some of the points that are more relevant and more interesting to you guys. So what is this invasion about? The first thing I would like to say, this is a surprising invasion. It surprised most people, from top politicians to experts and writers, journalists, because it breaks a Soviet and Russian pattern of caution. I know it could be difficult to imagine I would use these words these days, but with the exception of Afghanistan, 1980 to 1989, the Soviet Union and then Russia were never overextended. They never bit more than they could chew. You go back to Cuba in 1962 and Africa, which Cuba ended in a compromise, Africa, Vietnam, and more lately Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Crimea, Syria, Libya. These are all relatively small operations that Russia could handle, and they got away with it and they won most of these. So now why this big chunk of big mouthful in Ukraine? I would step back a little bit in history very quickly before we come to the current events. And you have to keep in mind that Ukraine is divided between two worldviews, two Weltanschauung, if you want. One is the Russian nationalist view that sees Ukraine as the cradle of Russia, Rus, where the religion comes from, and culture and history and the identity. And then there's a Ukrainian nationalist view that says, well, Rus is really an offshoot of Ukraine. Before they took Ukraine, and Peter the Great started using the word Russia. Before that, it was really the Dutch of Muscovy. It was Moscow, it wasn't Russia. So these two are deep-rooted identities that are difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile. Then there is the western part of Ukraine, which for a long time was part of Poland and Slovakia, and before that the Austrian Empire. There's many Catholics there. That's also a bit different. I'm saying this to emphasize that I don't think there is a way out of this unless you accommodate through compromise these different views of what the country is all about. So fast forward in history, we get to 1989. End of the Soviet Union, Ukraine becomes an independent country. What happens is that Russia is very weak. It's what a lot of experts call the unipolar moment. The US is the only superpower. John Mearsheimer talks about liberal hegemony, universal liberal hegemony. There is a widespread conviction that communism lost, capitalism won. It's not the end of history, perhaps, as Francis Fukuyama said, but it's the beginning of a very long new chapter in history. And in this new chapter in history, the Americans run the show, and the Russian resurgence, the new Russia, new powerful Russia that could threaten this must be avoided. So what happens is, unlike what happened during World War II, where the defeated country, Germany mostly, Italy to some extent, Japan, were co-opted and integrated into the new world order. Russia here is not. And this happens, again, I'm simplifying for reasons of time, in mostly two areas. One is the EU. The EU starts expanding trade, liberalism, integration. This is an irritant for Russia. But it has no security dimension, and therefore Russia is irritated, but not that much. Also, it doesn't include Soviet republics, except, of course, you might say the Baltic states. But Baltic states are really never part of the Soviet Union. They were occupied by the Soviet Union. They were never part of the Russian frame of empire. They were never certainly felt by any stretch of the imagination as part of Russia. So the EU is a problem, but not that big. NATO enlargement is more problematic for Russia because it is clearly designed as a protection against the resurgence of a Russian power in Europe. We, at that time in NATO, kept saying, well, this is not really against NATO. In fact, the door is open. One day Russia will join NATO as well. Some people meant that seriously, but mostly it was clear that this was never going to be the case. What had been until then, when NATO membership began to be offered to other countries, talking about the mid-1990s, ended a period of peaceful coexistence with Russia. After the INF treaty between Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987, Russia didn't take any hostile action against the West until the expansion of NATO began to touch at its borders. George Kennan, very authoritatively, you may know, some may know who George Kennan was. He's the author of the X article in 1946 in Foreign Affairs, the father of containment, the guy who formulated the American and Western policy towards Soviet Union after World War II. He argued very forcefully in 1994, you can find it easily in an article, in NATO's expansion was going to damage this new cooperation, this new cooperative arrangement we had with Russia, independent Russia. The US did promise, specifically Secretary of State Baker did promise to the Russians that he would not expand NATO. He said, let us join unified Germany, which was a big topic at the time. We're talking 1990, follow the wall, Germany unified. The US said, well, let's keep all Germany united in NATO. The Russians wanted to have Germany unified but neutral, but we will not expand further than that. This text was not public at the time, but it was published later under some Freedom of Information Act. The NATO Secretary General, Manfred Werner, German, maybe the best Secretary General NATO's ever had, in 1990 did make a public speech in which he said NATO has no intention to put forces in countries in Eastern Europe other than East Germany, which is now part of the new Germany. With that background, we get into the mid-1990s, and as NATO starts offering membership to new countries, former Warsaw Pact, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary first, we in the Secretariat were tasked with devising a new relationship with the two big ones that were left out, Ukraine and Russia. And I worked on drafting the Ukrainian charter, NATO-Ukraine charter, you can find it online, in which NATO said, we cannot have you join NATO yet, but we'll support your territorial integrity, your sovereignty, your independence. And then we had a similar deal with the Russians, the founding act of NATO-Russia relations, in which we said we support Russia, independence and cooperation and so on. No time to get into the details. So we had these two sort of consolation prizes for Ukraine and Russia. And then in 1999, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary joined NATO, first former communist countries to join NATO. That didn't go down well in Russia. More countries joined by 2004, the Baltic states, lo and behold, joined NATO, and so on and so forth, until now we have 30 members. We used to have 16 when I started there, and we have almost twice as many. Keep adding flags, the garden of NATO is full of new flags, and that does not go down well. And when the enlargement of NATO touches on the territory of the former Soviet Union, that's when things really change. Putin is now president. He gives a speech in Munich in 2007 at the Wehrkundetagung, big annual meeting of top shots in foreign affairs and security, in which basically he said, enough is enough. This is now an existential threat for us. Don't move any further, don't go any further. This is not going down well. The response of NATO is in 2008, Bucharest summit of heads of state and government. So a few months later, the leaders of NATO countries state, and it's in writing, look up the Bucharest communique of 2008, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. They don't put a date on it, but they say they will become members of NATO. And then, of course, they do nothing about it, which is part of the problem, I think. They promised membership, but didn't do anything about it. And a few months later, you have the war in Georgia. Georgia is trying to recapture some territories in Abkhazia and North Ossetia taken illegally by Russia, because Russians live there, but that's not a reason to take land from another country. And of course, Russia wins that particular conflict and NATO does nothing about it. So this is the change, the epochal change, the beginning of a more conflictual relationship between NATO and Russia. The next step NATO does is to deploy ballistic missile defense systems. To begin, it's again a long story, but to begin deploying missile defense systems, which they say are not against Russia, but they are against the possible threat from Iran and so on. They deployed them on the Polish Belarusian border, on the Romanian Ukrainian border, on ships in the Black Sea and the North Sea. So again, the Russians don't like it. Then the pivotal point, and go back to the specific of Ukraine, is 2013, when you have President of Ukraine, Yanukovych. Some of you may remember his name. He was elected, he was pro-Russian, but he was open, to deals with the EU and cooperate with NATO. In fact, he had drafted with the EU a very comprehensive cooperation agreement. And Russians didn't like that either. A few days before, or maybe it was even the day before that this agreement was supposed to be signed, Yanukovych said, you know what, I changed my mind. And then it turned out that he had been offered discounted gas and oil by Putin, and Putin had offered to buy $15 billion of Ukrainian bonds, state bonds, which nobody wanted otherwise, but Putin bought them. So you have the Maidan revolution. You probably are aware at the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, there is an upheaval against this change of mind of the presidency of Yanukovych. And then there is what really has to be called a coup d'etat in Ukraine, which was helped and supported from the outside, from the US, from other Western countries, although Europe was divided about that. You can see the tapes which have been leaked. They're on YouTube by American leaders, notably by Victoria Nuland, who's now Deputy Secretary of State. So Yanukovych, the pro-Russian guy who changed his mind, is thrown out. He goes to Russia, and here it comes. Now we have a pro-Western government in Ukraine. And that's obviously something that didn't go down well in Russia. Again, a few months later, you remember in 2008, after the Bucharest summit, a few months later, the Georgia invasion, a few months after the coup in Kiev, then Russia grabs Crimea, peninsula of southern Ukraine, inhabited mostly by Russians, and then starts stirring up trouble in Donbass, which builds up over the following few years until the situation that we have now. So in the view of some people, you can say, well, you see, that proves it. Although Ukraine didn't join NATO yet, well, the Russians still grabbed Ukraine, stirred up trouble in Donbass, and now invaded. The other view is, and you can make up your own mind, is the one that I share with Zbigniew Brzezinski, with Harry Kissinger, and I mentioned before George Kennan, is that we did not take into account the fact that although Russia was weak at the fall of the Soviet Union, it wouldn't be weak forever. And especially great powers, no enemy cooperates in war, in competition, in grand strategy, but especially a great power is not going to just accept that it's going to be diluted into oblivion forever. And at the time, of course, this is when China was beginning to really make a comeback onto the world scene, 1980s, early 90s, early 90s, 2000. And what happened was that the West, and here I put everybody together, really, I mean, the Americans as well as Western Europeans, undid what Nixon and Kissinger had done in the 70s. When Nixon went to China, the main point was to make sure that China and the Soviet Union, both communist countries, that they had disagreements already anyway, but make sure that he would have a deal. He went to Moscow as well. He tried to play one against the other. Kissinger, who by the way is still alive and he writes amazingly well. What we have done now is to basically undo this, and we have been pushing Russia and China together. You have a rising China, economically more powerful, militarily not as much, but still more and more powerful. Russia economically weak, but still militarily powerful. We are pushing them together, and you've seen in the news in the last few weeks, but you can go back a few years, how this could be a really dangerous situation for the West, and it could be worse if you believe Brzezinski, speaking of Brzezinski, the advisor and strategist of the 70s and the 80s, who just before he passed away in the late 90s, he wrote a book called Grand Coalition or something like that, in which he says, look, if we're not careful, you can have a grand coalition of Russia, China, and Iran. We won't talk about that today, but who are going to put the differences aside and have an alliance that could be hostile to the West. So that, I think, is something that all Western countries have lost sight of, this long-term strategic thinking when making policy choices in international relations. And now we have a situation, very tragic situation. I don't want to give the impression that what I've said so far in any way justifies or applaud what Putin is doing. It's terrible, it's wrong, and it's inexcusable. But what I've tried to highlight is what I think are some of the main factors that produced this situation. Now Russia lost its traditional caution that I meant before. It bit, I think, a lot more than it can chew. And I think it has already shot itself in the foot, and maybe in other private parts as well. What only can change this, I think, is a top at the top of the Kremlin, change in the leadership of Russia. I don't know whether there is any likelihood of that happening in a short term, but I don't see that. I see that as the only hope for the near future. We have, of course, a wise policy in place by the Americans and by the rest of NATO of not starting World War III over Ukraine. That's, few can argue against that. But then what else do we do? Well, we've got sanctions. I hope I'm wrong here, but I've been studying sanctions, and my country, Italy, was the first that was subjected to sanctions back in 1935, when Mussolini had this brilliant idea of having an empire. He wanted to be a great power like France and Britain. So we conquered Ethiopia, and we had in the League of Nations slapped sanctions. Well, did that make Italy leave Ethiopia? Of course not. In fact, it made Mussolini more popular. And what about sanctions against Japan in the late 30s? Did that make the Japanese military imperialists desist from invading China and invading Southeast Asia? No, it produced Pearl Harbor. And so on. You have sanctions that have been applied against the USSR, against China, against Iran, against Iraq, against Cuba forever, against North Korea, against Syria. None of these sanctions has ever made a difference in terms of changing the policy of these countries. Sanctions do make a difference in terms of the economy, in terms of the suffering of people, in terms of lost business opportunities in the countries that impose the sanctions, but they have never produced a policy change in the target country. I hope that I'm wrong. These sanctions these days are far more comprehensive and wide-ranging than any of the ones I mentioned a minute ago. I hope I'm wrong, but I fear that if I'm right, then this is not going to produce the change that we all hope for. So what's the way ahead? I think Russia has lost ground. I'll conclude with a few points on the way ahead. Russia has already lost the military battles, again, surprisingly. Again, They did not think, I can't imagine, if Putin really believed that he would be welcomed in Ukraine the way he was really welcomed in Crimea, because Crimea is full of Russians. I mean, it's inhabited by Russians, but not the rest of Ukraine. They're been bogged down by logistics problems, organizational problems, equipment problems, morale problems. It's been a disaster for the Russian military. Of course, part of that is because of the Western help in terms of anti-tank and anti-aircraft systems we provided to them, to the Ukrainians. And that's, I think, why Putin has even mentioned I don't know if he actually mentioned the word, but he made it clear he would, I think he did mention the word of nuclear weapons, which of course is something that should scare all of us, particularly those of us living in Europe. Of course, many times we have said, oh, he would never do that, he's bluffing. But many times Putin proved us wrong. He did what he said he would do. Now, hopefully this time we won't get to that, and we'll have some solution to the conflict very soon. I think also to keep in mind for the future, what's important is that Russia definitely will not win hearts in Ukraine. They may conquer land, but they will not win hearts and minds for sure. In fact, that has consolidated the Ukrainian polity, if you want, around the presidency of Zelensky. And that's something that's new. That was not before. As I said, Ukraine was a very divided country, culturally, politically. Now it's going to be compacted together. And yet they'll have to coexist with Russia. There is family ties, there's geography. We cannot change the geography. Economic interdependence. Russia and Ukraine will have to coexist together. And the word, I think the key word here, which I was happy to hear in the last couple of days from both Russian and Ukrainian negotiators, is compromise. This is not winner take all. It cannot be. Again, Henry Kissinger wrote a piece in The Economist in which he said, this, you can't have it all. It's going to be a perpetuation of conflict and bloodshed. His view, which I personally share, but see what people think, is that the Finland solution could be a good one. That is to say, membership in the EU, but not in NATO. By the way, Finland is not in NATO, but has very, very close relationship with NATO, military as well, information exchange, equipment, training, and so on. But there's no US missiles in Finland, And the same, by the way, applies to Sweden, Austria, and Switzerland is a bit different, but these three countries along the old border of the West and the Warsaw Pact provide, I think, a good model for what Ukraine could be doing. I think that's the only way that we have a hope to keep the territorial integrity to a large extent, at least, of Ukraine, including the Donbass, where I think the Ukrainians will have to give more autonomy, more use of the Russian language, which was not always the case in the past couple of decades. I think Crimea is more difficult. I don't see Crimea coming back to Ukraine, but again, I hope I'm wrong. I hope one solution somebody mentioned is it could be a permanent lease. It could be recognized as Ukrainian, but on a permanent lease to Russia. I don't think that's going to work, but we'll see. But the basic problem for Putin, and I'll close on this, is that he has done more for NATO than any other leader in the past decades. He has been able to compact NATO. Remember a couple of years ago, Macron said NATO is brain dead. Trump wanted to pull the US out of NATO, let the Europeans pay for themselves. All presidents say that, but Trump, I think, really was close to considering really, let's pull the US out of NATO. Now European defense spending is going through the roof left and right. Germany is increasing defense spending. And NATO is now focused again on Europe. You remember NATO went to Afghanistan, to Libya. It failed, but now the original mission, defending the member states, Article 5, one for all for one, is again at the core of NATO speak. And that's what I think is important, and Putin will regret that perhaps. I think the final point is there is a need also, although it's difficult these days, to think in terms of when this is all over, when Putin is gone and hopefully underground somewhere, then we will have to establish a new relationship with a new Russia that comes out of this mess. What that relationship is going to be, how we can think of make it more cooperative and more inclusive, also from the point of view of security, and not just buying gas and trading with them. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. I'm ready for your questions.
Thank you very much, Marco. Very, very insightful. So I'll go straight to questions. I'll try to help you out here a little bit. And as a reminder, everyone, you could write your questions into the chat box or raise your hand virtually. So I've got a quick question from Alvaro on the chat box, Marco, which is, what are the possible scenarios for a way out in the short term and the best option in your opinion?
Thank you. This is from Alvaro, I guess. Sorry. Again, there is no crystal ball, but the key word is what Kissinger said, is a compromise. It's difficult for me, and I think for most people, after what we've seen in the last few weeks, to think of compromise, but I don't see any other better way. And compromise means that Ukraine will have to accept that it is a multicultural, forget about now multi-ethnic, it's a multicultural country. It's not a homogeneous nation, and I think that's possible. I went to Donbass. I've met Russian speakers, people who didn't speak Ukrainians, but they felt Ukrainians. They spoke Russian, but they felt Ukrainians. And I went to speak on their TV. This is like, must have been 2001 or something. And they say, yeah, we're different. We're Donetsk. It's not the same as Lviv. Yeah, of course they're different. So we should do that. And I think the Ukrainian government hasn't always done that. Of course, a prerequisite is Russia's withdrawal. I mean, you don't negotiate with the gun to your head. The Russian military, there could be ways, they can declare victory and go home, like it often happens in war. But the Russian military has to leave, I think, for any meaningful settlement to take place. And then the solution that is, the Finlandization, I think would suit everybody. Finland, Sweden, Austria, these are some of the most successful countries in the world, in the history of the world. They're free, they're rich, they trade with everybody, they don't have any enemies. Who doesn't like the Swedes? Come on, and that's what I think Ukraine could and should aim for, to be a new big Finland that trades with everybody and is friends with everybody. Another question I have here, Ukrainians are very passionate about Crimea and Donbass, and the Ukrainian government is very likely to lose any support or control over the country if Ukrainians are unhappy about the conditions. Well, yeah, as I said, Ukrainians the Ukrainian government, whoever is there, has to understand that really, they know it. It's not like that. They don't need to understand. They know it, and they have to accept that Donbass is different, that Crimea definitely is very different. That's not up to me or to us. It's going to have to be. It could be hard to swallow for the Ukrainians to say, look, after what the Russians have done to us, we've got to give them use of the Russian language and this and that. But I don't see another way.
Marco, just you may have missed it, but there's a question from Alex before the one you just asked, and he's asked the second one. So Alex's two questions are, is the war or invasion winnable for Russia? And then Alex also asked, how can a China-Russia coalition in opposition to the West be avoided?
Okay. Winnable, I mentioned that in my introduction. I think Russia has already lost. I mean, the military has performed miserably, embarrassingly, I would say, for, you know, a big power. So they might still, you know, do what they've done in Chechnya, reduce Ukrainian cities to rubble and then occupy them. But the Ukrainians won't and shouldn't and won't back down. I mean, they'll start guerrilla war, they'll have an insurgency forever. So in that sense, it's not winnable. I think Russia's already lost. That's why I think Putin mentioned nuclear escalation. Of course, that wouldn't win it either, because what are you going to do? Nuke Ukraine and then what? You know, it doesn't make sense. But Putin has done things that don't make sense. And what would we do next? Of course, I cannot tell. Like I don't know. So I don't. The answer is no. I don't think the war is winnable. And in terms of China and Russia, again, we have to, as Westerners, and especially as Americans, but, you know, also Europeans, Japanese, we have to understand that in history you have always had a balance of power. You may have empires that come and go, and that's not necessarily a good thing, but sometimes it buys you from a little bit stability, a little bit of peace. And most successful empires are the ones that where the subjects of the empire, the nations that belong to the empire, are there willingly. In the time of the Roman Empire, some, you know, tribes and so on, they wanted to be under Rome. And with the Americans and with the United States, a lot of countries want to be in NATO and friends with America and so on. So that's, you know, we need to understand that. We need to understand that we cannot expect as Westerners, as United States, to run the world. We've had a shot at it for about 10 years after the end of the Cold War, but that's not a stable long-term scenario. You need to make compromises. So if you have now, you know, before you had two, you had the Soviet Union and the United States. Now you have China, which is very powerful and getting more and more powerful. You simply cannot. So you have to make compromises over different issues. Over, in this case, is Ukraine, and in other way, it could be in China, it could be Taiwan, it could be South China Sea, it could be on trade, on technology exchanges. But if you want to have it your way all the time, all around the world, it's just too ambitious. I think that's not going to work. I mean, when Nixon went to China, I mentioned before, that was a masterstroke of Kissinger. Do you think Nixon liked Mao? I mean, this is Mao, Cultural Revolution. You know, the re-education camps in China at that time was far less palatable as a partner than Russia is today. And Nixon, a conservative, pro-business, with Kissinger, they went to Mao. They went there and said, okay, let's talk. Let's see what we can do together and cooperate and start a relationship. I think that's what we should do. And next one, is there a realistic possibility that Finland and Sweden end up joining NATO now that the popularity of that move has increased? Yes, that's another way the Russians have shot themselves in the foot. I mean, there were the issue of Finland in NATO has come up over the decades a number of times, but it never really gelled, you know, because I think correctly, most Finns in the end said, look, you know, we don't need that. We can cooperate with NATO, we'll buy American weapons, whatever, but we don't need to ruffle Russian feathers. You know, we'll be neutral. We'll be in the EU, we adopt the euro, we're in Schengen, we're, you know, they're Westerners, but they're not in NATO. So, but now, yes, now the popularity of the position that argues no, the only way to guarantee Finland's securities to join NATO, that is now more popular than, I'm not sure, but I think than it's ever been before. And the same with Sweden, I think maybe a bit less, but so the answer is yes. Will that be a good idea? I don't think so. I don't think so, but it wouldn't be nearly as bad as Ukraine joining NATO from a Russian point of view, because obviously these are not part of the Russian ego and the Russian identity. I mean, this brings up a question that many people talk about these days. It's like, how can you condemn, so to say, force countries to be buffer states? Countries should be able to decide whatever they want. Do they want to be allies of this or that? And why should you? Well, yes, that's true. Countries in an ideal world should be free to decide their alliances and so on. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world that's not perfect, far from it. And so I think the idea of, again, of the buffer state, which Finland has understood very well and has implemented spectacularly well over the last 70 years, is still something that ought to be considered. How isolated Russia really feels today, in your opinion? Economic power really chokes their economy. China, India, most countries in the Southern Hemisphere. Sorry, these are long ones, but very neutral, either because they're not willing to. I think when you say how Russia feels, it depends who you talk to in Russia. Many Russians in the last few years, they have been, although their country is not really free, but they have been exposed to ideas, different views. They have traveled, they have foreign friends. I know Russians, who don't like their government, who don't like not just their government, their system, who want Russia to be open and free. And but of course, the dynamics of the Russian politics are such that these voices haven't been able to express themselves. The economic power of NATO chokes their economy. I don't think that's true. First of all, NATO doesn't have economic power. I mean, NATO is an alliance, a political military alliance that really has nothing to do with economics. Yes, there was an economic directorate. We had colleagues of mine studying the Soviet economy and then the Russian economy, mostly to understand how that would impact on the military aspect of things. But I don't think you can argue anybody's been really choking Russia's economy. We've been buying, whatever they had to sell. Russia, the problem is Russia doesn't have much to sell. I mean, look at what they've been exporting. Russia exports hydrocarbons. We all bought that for decades. In fact, for many years, the Americans were arguing against that, and we Europeans, we said, no, we'll build pipelines. And I think, by the way, that was right. I think at some point we should continue to buy, from Russia. Russia exports weapons, which maybe they won't much anymore because they haven't performed very well. The Russian weapons don't look very good now, but they do export a lot of that, and they export to countries like China or India, and they're not going to be sanctioned, so they'll continue to export them. But what, I mean, raise your hand, if anybody in the group here has bought something recently that says made in Russia on the label. I've bought pine nuts. I use them in my salad every day. I bought Siberian pine nuts, which are very good, by the way. But so I don't think we're really strangling the Russian economy. The Russian economy doesn't work because of the Soviet heritage, and then the wild privatizations that were not done right in the 90s, and then the Putin government didn't manage the economy well. They didn't do the right reforms and so on. So Russia is the problems of Russia's economy are of their own making. I don't think they can blame it on anybody else. Do you think that the atrocities still being committed in Mariupol today are intended strategies to force the Ukrainians to capitulate in peace talks, or an example of the Russian armed forces out of control and undisciplined? And will this cause the downfall of Putin? I think the first is true. I think it is a strategy that the Russians have used before, back to World War II, that we've used. I mean, when I say we, I mean the Americans, the British, the Germans, even the Italians to some extent. To go back to the Spanish Civil War, carpet bombing, trying to demoralize an enemy by destroying, every block of their major cities. That's something we have done. The Americans, forget the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Americans, in my view, I'm sorry to say correctly, they firebombed Tokyo in, I think it was March of 1945, because they didn't want to invade Japan. The Russians know that they're not going to have an easy time invading Ukraine. This is clear. So yes, they could try to force capitulation by doing what they're doing, bombing cities, hospitals, whatnot. Doesn't matter. I think we have seen, I mean, I read what you read. We have seen information coming through with the Russian armed forces being out of control, meaning that they're told to go and shoot at Ukrainian villages, cities, and they don't, because I mean there is reasonable people in the Russian armed forces as well. So we have seen, you can find videos of Russian army tanks or whatnot refusing to crush civilians who just lie down on the road to prevent them. And we'll discuss the downfall of Putin. I hope so, definitely. I know I'm not alone, but will it? I don't know. I go back, let's see what happened in Serbia, when Serbia and Milosevic in the 1999 NATO bombing and so on. I mean, Milosevic lost clearly, but he still remained in power for another couple of years or something, until in Serbia, forces in Serbia got rid of him. So I hope that will be the case as well. Do you see a risk of a neighboring country taking advantage of Russia completed disorganization and create more risk issues? Neighboring country, like I don't know who is posing a threat to Russia these days. Can't think of anybody really. Georgia, maybe, if that's what maybe you have in mind. I don't think so. I don't see any signs of that, but clearly there could be. I mean, there's no real dispute now. There used to be. There is no dispute now on the border between China and Russia. There was. They fought a couple of wars during the Soviet times, but then the other countries that border Russia, Kazakhstan, so they don't have really an issue. So I don't think. I mean, Finland definitely not, or Norway. They're definitely not going to try and take advantage of this. Andre, please.
Hey, Marco. Can you hear me? There's a lot of ambient noise.
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah. Sorry for not seeing your hand.
That's
before.
Okay. I just finished typing out my question, so I'll just read it out loud, I guess. Or, but so the reason I was so excited to hear you speak is because when I talk, I moved out of Russia when I was 17, just for the context. Spent 10 years living in the US, studying, working. Now I live in London. So my take on Russia is slightly different from a lot of the friends and relatives that I have there. And my question to you is, a lot of, since I can remember myself, we've always been told that, there's this threat, whether it's, well, it wasn't so much America, but it was NATO that is always there, that is always getting closer to Russian borders. And I think if you ask people who are in support of Putin's aggressive actions right now in Ukraine, or in his actions in Georgia, I think those people conditioning on those four are for his actions. I would say 98% will say that, well, he's doing that to protect Russian, security interests. My question. So sorry, I'm just kind of giving a little bit of a context.
No, that's interesting.
But I want to really understand, like, make sure people understand why I'm asking it. And I also want to find out how to talk to other Russian people, especially with their take on this. So if you were saying, if I got you correct, but in the 90s and the beginning of 2000s, you said that Russia was fairly a weak state, and I can probably confirm, having like observable data myself. What was the rationale for NATO to expand, or for example, to make those statements around Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, right? If economically Russia wasn't a threat, well, apart from maybe, I don't know, messing up with oil markets, militarily, again, also, I mean, yes, there are like nuclear weapons, there are tanks and stuff, but I don't think that was also a big threat either. So how was NATO thinking about it in the 90s and 2000s? Yeah, and how can I explain that to fellow Russian friends of mine?
Well, I can give you two answers. One is the sort of official answer that we had at that time, the official rationale that was going around in NATO headquarters and that we use, and the other one is what I think really was happening in people's minds, but people didn't say as much. The first is, we thought, I think genuinely to a large extent, that gradually you would have, just as you had the European Union expanding and having more countries join and more trade and more free travel and so on, in the military security sphere, NATO could do the same. So you would expand slowly, step by step, and more countries would feel secure under the big umbrella, the big American umbrella, because obviously, there's no NATO without the US. I mean, that's the main pillar, the umbrella, call it whatever you want. So, and these countries, to a large extent, they wanted to. They were asking to join NATO. So we said, and we would write and talk about this. Look, they want it. We'll join them in. It's not against. We're going to go step by step, expand this area of stability, cooperate together in fighting. Obviously, no enemies. Russia is not an enemy, but terrorists or proliferators or out of area. The big phrase at that time was NATO has to go out of area or out of business. Meaning, until then, it was defending NATO countries against the Soviet Union. That's the area, the NATO area. So there's no threat anymore. So we have to go out of area. So we go to Afghanistan, or we go to the Balkans, first of all, Bosnia and Kosovo. That was in the 90s, just a few years after the fall of the Soviet Union. We have to do that, otherwise NATO will go out of business. So that was the idea, And by the way, if you take the Balkans, 94 to 99, Bosnia, Kosovo, even though the Russians didn't really like that either, but in fact, they cooperated. We cooperated with the Russians in Bosnia, in Kosovo, very well. So that was the idea that was publicly advertised, and it was to a large extent true. But what was not advertised, but was as true, and the fact I think indicated, is a lot of countries were afraid of Russia resurrecting itself from the ashes of the Soviet Union and posing a threat again. After all, you had a Russian empire occupying, Finland and Poland and whatnot before there was even a Soviet Union. So it wasn't really a Soviet Union problem; it was a Russian problem, and so because of that, we NATO, under mostly American pressure, we said it's time to. Can you hear me? You still there? Yeah, it's time to expand NATO and make sure that we should do it now, that Russia is weak, to make sure that when Russia is strong again, then they cannot pose a threat to these countries, and we have expanded alliance, more countries helping each other, stronger NATO, and so on. So that's the explanation. Was that a good idea? I don't think so, personally. I mean, I can see the rationale, which is what I've told you, both the sort of official, more sort of soft one and the harder one. I can see that, but with George Kennan and Harry Kissinger and so on, who argued that this was a bad idea. So then you can, anybody can draw. We're not going back in history, but anybody can draw their own conclusions today.
But it almost feels, if I can ask a small follow-up, it almost feels like it's like all these political decisions that are being made. It's not a like one-time kind of like game theory type of game, right? Shouldn't this signaling somehow have been incorporated in those decisions, or was it more of a? What I'm trying to understand is it something like, was NATO thinking that Russia was going to be weaker for a longer time because of the oil prices, and then the oil prices cleared like $100 a barrel, and then all of a sudden Russia got a lot more powerful over time?
I think that's part of it, and the short-sightedness was at the time, in my view. Again, my view doesn't count for anything, but I'm in good company with people like Kissinger and George Kennan and a bunch of other people, is that, yes, okay, Russia was weak, cheap oil made it weaker, but it was fairly obvious that this was not going to last forever. I'll give you an example. I was dealing at some point with naval disarmament, for whatever reason. I just happened to deal with that. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviets, escadra, they call it, they had a fleet in the Mediterranean, and they had no more money, so they pulled it out. So we had a deal, we had a proposal that said, okay, the Russians are weak now, their navy has no money, the ships are rusting. Let's make a deal on naval arms control in the Mediterranean with very low levels, and so that when Russia is strong again, they're bound by a treaty and they cannot. And the answer was from the opposite side, we don't need a treaty. Russia has no ships. They're rusting in harbor. They have no fuel. No. The weapons are old. We don't need a treaty because Russia is weak. I think that was a mistake. I think it would have been good to co-opt, if you want to use the word co-opt, Russia. Negotiating conditions, and Russia was weak, so it would have accepted, I think, that it was no longer a superpower. And but co-opt it instead of marginalizing. Next question. There's been a lot of focus on NATO's driving cause of Russia's action. But is this true, given that NATO is a defensive alliance, and unlike the 50s, communism does not aim to radicalize society and destabilize governments? There's 2 points in the question. Even if the Russians believe NATO poses a security threat, how does Ukraine's membership change the picture? Given that today long-range missiles are quite deadly and accurate. In this context, how is the cost-benefit of Putin's action worth to prevent Ukraine from joining? Well, it's a complicated point from Francesco Rufino. Thank you very much. It's a complex point to raise, but NATO is a defensive alliance, but it is not seen as such by the Russians. And if you are American and you have the Soviet Union stationing missiles in Cuba, and they say, oh, but that's defensive, we need to protect the revolution, we're not threatening you. Well, Kennedy didn't agree with that point of view. So the fact that NATO is defensive, it's created in the late 40s to defend Western Europe from the Soviet Union. Countries joined NATO voluntarily, unlike the Warsaw Pact, where they were forced. So yes, it is a defensive alliance, and it has been successfully, but that doesn't mean that some of the actions taken after the end of the Cold War were not, in my view, unnecessarily provocative. So, that's what it is. I mean, you can say, I don't care, but the cost benefit of Putin's actions, I think he's miscalculated. I think he got, I don't know what's in his mind, but he's a smart person. He was very cautious for many years, ruthless, but never overstepping the boundaries of what he could achieve. And at some point he lost it. He's now done harm to Russia and to himself. Hopefully he'll be out of the picture soon. But how does the cost benefit calculation work in his head? I'm sorry, I don't think I can understand that. That's it's not a rational way of approaching the issue. This is not going to make Russia, even under the most optimistic scenario from a Russian point of view. Let's say they were, there was a short war, it was successful, and Ukraine gave up, and they occupy Ukraine, and then what? You've made enemies of just about everybody in Europe. The only country I think that's been supporting them is Serbia. I don't know if you've seen the Serbian government has been sort of sitting on the edge, and there's been people in Serbia demonstrating in favor of Russia, and I think it's the only place in Europe. So, and you look at the United Nations vote on the invasion. Who voted for Russia? Against the criticism of Russia? North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, I think, and maybe nobody else. I mean, if these are your friends, you have a saying, tell me your friends, I'll tell you who you are. So you're in the company of North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela. That explains, I think, a lot about the miscalculation. Eritrea, good. Thank you, Alex. Yes, Eritrea, one of probably the worst dictatorship, brutal dictatorship in the world these days. So, somebody in the Kremlin must be thinking, how come that's all the support we get is from these people? Something doesn't square, Did I answer all the questions? I'm confused as you are about cost benefit, even when one does not account for stronger international response. People, thinks, who knows? It's what we don't know that, but what we do know is that if we had approached the post-Cold War order, security order in Europe differently, very likely either we would have no Putin, or Putin would be behaving differently. Could be his personal ambitions, that's for sure. I mean, he's been in power for 22 years and shows no sign of retiring, of wishing to retire. So yes, but personal ambitions, if you're a dictator of a big power in history, you have to have personal ambitions. Misplaced ambitions, this is not good for his people, whatever the outcome. But still, yes, ambitions, personal ambitions do count. Yeah. We have a sense of how popular the war is in Russia. I'm not in Russia. I haven't been there in a few years. Information, of course, is censored in Russia, so it's hard to say. We have seen that there was this lady who was then arrested, showing up on Russian TV with a big sign, against Russia, against the war. I have some personal friends, like 3, and they are, all 3 are against the war. They said it's a bad idea, we shouldn't have done it. We don't like NATO's expansion, but this is wrong, So, but we don't have opinion polls, we don't have a sense of, and I'm sure it depends if you talk to sophisticated, educated people in Russian cities, or if you go to some village, where all people know is what they get in the TV or the posters that Putin is putting up all over the country. That's going to change the opinion.
Great. Marco, I hate to sort of draw a line under it there, but I get the feeling that we could keep going for a couple more hours. So listen, the good news or bad news, depending on how you think of it, is we may need to have you back, and hopefully to talk about a relatively constructive and positive conclusion to this conflict. But either way, I think there'll be a demand to have you back. So let me start with that request / invitation.
With pleasure, with great pleasure. Thank you very much, and thank you for all the questions that I got. That helps me also to develop my thinking. But yes, by all means, I'd be happy to. We can do it again. Maybe celebrate the peace in a few weeks.
Yeah, that would be a good reason. But thank you to you and for making the time for this. And I suspect we'll have you back for other subjects, given, as I said, you seem to be a man of many interests and talents. So hope to have you back for another topic or this topic. Really appreciate, as Marco said, everyone's questions and discussion on this important topic. And thank you to everyone, and hopefully see you at future events of the MIT Club of Great Britain. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day, morning, afternoon, or evening. Bye.
Bye.